Good evening, everybody. This is Bishop Tim here from the guest bedroom at our son Isaac's house in Durham, where there's a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. It's bath time here, and sometimes that ends up with shrieks and screams, and other times happy squeals, but it's never quiet. So I will go ahead and give that disclaimer right up front. That's what we get today. And I think if yeah, if everybody would uh, mute your microphone if you're not speaking, just because when we get so many of us on here, we get uh, funny, funny sorts of things that happen here. But we have with us tonight uh, Lexi Barnhill, who is our Synod event planner, who works at the Synod office full time. Also happens to be a Sam right now, but Lexi's been sick for a couple weeks, so we're really grateful that she's worked hard to help us get this going this evening. Tammy Jones West is here. Deacon Tammy was on Synod staff for quite a number of years, and then just did the National Youth Gathering. What did you call that? Executive director or whatever of that for the one that happened in New Orleans. And then when we needed somebody to take over as I twisted her arm and all kinds of things. She graciously agreed to help us as the Synod Assembly manager for this season. Also from our staff, Pastor Cece Mills is here, and Pastor Cece and I were the two staff liaison people to the Compensation Guidelines Committee. And our Synod treasurer is here. Pastor Tony Bradshaw is here. And the other person who we didn't really have chairs and co-chairs, but the other sort of main person on the Compensation Guidelines Committee who's with us tonight is Karen Muse, who was I guess is retired now, but for quite a number of years was an admin at our office admin. I don't know what the title was, but at Christ the King in Cary, and so has dealt with compensation questions and all sorts of other church things for many years. So I thought I would just pray, and then I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Andrew and to Karen. So we are recording, so just be aware, because there are people who might want to see this who can't be here tonight. So whatever we do say, type somewhat is public information. So let's pray. Gracious God, we are grateful that you shower us with abundant gifts, and we pray that you would bless us through these gifts to be your faithful people, and that whatever we have in any tangible or material way, that we might use that and translate that into serving. And make your presence known this evening as we talk about compensation guidelines and as we discern where we move forward with these recommendations and what the processes are going to be. And we ask these things in the name of Christ. Amen. I'll just say right before I give it to Pastor Andrew, the Synod Council received these guidelines back in late February. We had our meeting in early March. We talked about the compensation guidelines that are proposed that you have received or have available to you. And while there was, conversation, hearty conversation at Synod Council, the Synod Council has already approved this. And so tonight, we're not talking about changing the recommendation. The next thing that will happen in any official way is the presentation and the vote on the floor at Synod Assembly. But we thought we would do this now to save us some time and to better prepare us for that conversation at Assembly. So Pastor Andrew, take it away.
Bishop Tim, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the meeting. A couple of things as we get ready to kind of chat through these things. I think Tammy might have put links in the chat that will help you if you want to look for the guidelines. There's two, 2026 and 2027. Those are on the Synod website, but if you want to bring them up and have them on your computer, that might be handy just to be able to look through while we have our conversation. It's been an honor to work with this committee. The compensation committee is quite a few folks who are here on our evening meeting tonight. Maybe if we would, if you're on the compensation committee team, if you just give a wave. Thank you for your good work, and feel free to chime in throughout the evening. So Karen Muse and I worked on these guidelines on behalf of the committee. The committee has shared them on, but our focus is going to be to provide a little bit of background and rationale for the guidelines, and then take some time to hopefully welcome comments, questions, and other ways you'd like to express thoughts. Just to be upfront, the reason we have guidelines for 2026 and 2027 is a logistical thing. As the Synod Assembly has moved to every other year now, at the Assembly, we have to approve 2 years worth of guidelines in advance. So that's why you'll see 2026 and 27, which also is a little bit of an interesting thing. It's hard to look that far into the future with things like guidelines and to be able to put things together that far ahead. But this is the best effort, at least for a couple of years out. The guidelines themselves are for a full-time ministry call for both ministers of word and sacrament and ministers of word and service, such as deacons. As such, these full-time guidelines also create the framework for the determination of part-time calls in ministry, and that's so compensation for full and part-time calls is consistent with the expectations of time and service within all these calls. The guidelines themselves are designed to streamline compensation across the Synod and to help foster mutually beneficial long-term partnerships between congregations and their called ministers. There's been a pretty good general agreement that the current and prior NC Synod guidelines were a little bit challenging to utilize and to navigate. This often, as I understand it, resulted in calls to the Synod office for clarity and assistance in using the guidelines. So our goal as a committee has been to make these guidelines both thorough and fairly user-friendly so that both church leadership and ministers could easily utilize the guidelines, and it also includes a worksheet to annually determine proper compensation and benefit considerations in all the various ministry settings. I will add, our hope was to actually shorten this document. As we originally received it, it was about 18 to 20 pages. We managed to shrink it down to 17. That's not really much of an accomplishment, but my initial thought was we could make it 5 pages, and that went out the window in a big hurry. So, but in order to be thorough and to make it user-friendly, we really had to go with providing a pretty good amount of information. So the North Carolina compensation guidelines, to give you a little background, they've not really been updated in any real sense in some time. They've been given in each year, but not really updated since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So it became pretty clear to the compensation committee that some in-depth analysis of economic realities of the COVID years was needed, and then how those factors needed consideration for determining fair and proper compensation moving forward. The guidelines were also in long need of a rewrite for clarity, as I mentioned earlier, and to make them easier to follow and a little bit more user-friendly. If this might be helpful, this is kind of my thought of an example of why we're doing this. So imagine if we're doing a home renovation. Usually in a home renovation, the structure of the home is pretty solid, but we need to modernize various elements of the home. Same thing here. These guidelines were structured fairly well. They were very specific, had a lot of detail. We've tried to take a little bit of that to make it a little more common language, easier to follow, but to modernize them all the way. Except for a slight revision in 2023, the guidelines really haven't been updated since 2021. And if you go follow that, that means they were approved in 2020, and those were likely conceived somewhere in about 2019. So there's been a good little while since we've undertaken this in the way we have now. During the pandemic, and especially since 2021, there have been some pretty significant inflation realities across the last several years. I think we're all aware of that. From the year 2021 to present, the cumulative inflation has been right at almost about 20% over that time. Thus, in the year 2025, a leader in ministry at today's current guidelines is experiencing a roughly 20% decrease in compensation versus just year 2021, not that long ago. This has had some real economic effect on our Synod's ministry leaders, effectively reducing their economic purchasing capability by the same 20%. This affects ministry leaders' ability to provide for their families, to cover life expenses, including housing, childcare, transportation, daily needs, student loan payments, children's educational costs, as well as having an effect on retirement savings and other current and future financial considerations. So with this information, the committee set forth to faithfully realign these guidelines with the 2021 compensation figures so that rostered ministers will not continue to incur a significant and inherent decrease in pay due really to inflation, and to allow congregations to make a gradual compensation adjustment across 2 calendar years. Therefore, the two-step compensation increase has been reflected in 2026 and the 2027 guidelines. The 2026 guidelines represent the first increase. The second step increase takes place in 2027. This will then, by 2027, fully realign minister compensation with inflation as adjusted from year 2021. So the guidelines for 2026 and 2027 contain 3 important parts. And I'm going to kind of go over in opposite order of what folks might suspect are their level of importance. The third most important item was to have the defined compensation charts. That's what most people jump into when they go to the guidelines. They want to see, what does the chart say? It does have that information, and the defined compensation does follow 3 parts that create that defined compensation, including the minister's salary, the SECA, Self-Employment Contribution Act, Social Security tax contribution, and the minister's housing allowance. Those 3 added together create the defined compensation number that is reflected in the charts. Second, the guidelines reflect the compensation related aspects of health benefits, retirement benefits, vacation and sick time, sabbaticals, professional expenses, and also reflect local and experience factors that may also increase ministers' compensation. And really, first of all, uh, is a determination of full-time and part-time ministry, and then their related expectations and equal consideration of compensation and service. There is also an add-on component that covers specialized ministry, such as compensation for supply preaching. Synod authorized ministers or synodically authorized ministers are SAMs, interim ministers for interim ministry, as well as how seminary students are compensated for supply service, for example. What is hoped to be the most helpful element of these guidelines is the included compensation worksheet. I think that's on page 10 and 11 on your guidelines if you want to jump to there and take a look. This is designed so that leadership and ministers can work together to determine a minister's annual compensation according to guidelines, and to be as simple and streamlined as possible. Finally, there's a couple of appendix to this document that provide information related to the role or definitions for rostered ministers, and then additional information for leave policies, continuing education, first call theological education, and sabbatical leave. That's kind of the guidelines in a nutshell, a little bit of rationale and how they came to be and the work of the committee. This took a lot of iterations to get to where we are, and it's still just a proposed document. It's for the Senate Assembly to discern and to vote on. I think the revisions, Karen, you might help me with this, somewhere in the neighborhood between you and I working on this, I counted like 16 revisions or 15, I don't remember. It started in one place and it kept going. But finally, we were able to get these to you, and we're glad to do that. We want to welcome conversation this evening, curiosities and questions. We'll do the best we can to be helpful in answering those kind of things. I'd like to kind of throw it over to Karen. Karen, if you have anything you'd like to share or add about the process or the guidelines, please do.
Well, that was a very thorough overview, Andrew. I don't have a lot to add. I would just say I think there's 2 major things that are critical in this revision, other than it's structurally different. It used to have a narrative and the guidelines, and everybody ignored the narrative. But the 2 major things were to adjust for inflation, for true inflation, and Andrew addressed that, And the other thing is to provide a framework for congregations to consider less than a full-time call. If they can't afford a full-time call, to provide a framework in which they could perhaps reduce hours, reduce responsibilities, partner with another congregation, employ a SAM, whatever. But we wanted the full-time compensation structure to really be fairly represent what our ministers should be paid. And I've been on the compensation committee for 3 or 4 years, I think, and we really were just adjusting the numbers every year. I hope that you find this document much more helpful and easier to read and go through. So I think we can open it up to questions now.
Yeah, thank you. And please do chime in. We'll welcome anyone who'd like. However, I guess just unmute, let us know. I'm not good at running meetings, so I'm going to rely on Tammy
Yeah.
and Tim and
Well,
others.
let me
yeah.
let me interject, Andrew. I just typed in the chat that the ideal way would be if you would. It's hard to know when you're in Zoom whose turn it is to talk, especially when you have multiple screens of people. And so if you wanted to type it in the chat bar, we'll make sure we get to it. Or if you would like to raise your hand at the bottom of your screen, if you hover down at the bottom with your cursor, there should be a button, something that says audio, video, participants, chat, react. If you click on the react button at the bottom, then you'll get a menu that toward the bottom of that menu has a raise hand feature. I mean, if you want to just jump right in and unmute and start talking, but possibly 3 or 4 of us might do that at the same time. We'll get to it one way or another.
I raised my hand, but I don't know if.
Yeah, I see Linda Warren's hand, so go ahead, Linda.
Hi, I just have a question on the compensation for specialized ministry, as in supply. And is there a formula that we use if a congregation cannot afford these new numbers?
So page number 12, thank you. So I don't have a great answer. I don't want to speak on behalf of the committee on this. There's going to be some challenges like that. The economic realities of kind of putting together what is the right number or what's the target number. Some of this is reflective of similar synods nearby and how they also have created their guidelines in a similar way. I don't know if there's some synod support for congregations that might have a challenge in that regard. Certainly, the guidelines here are what they are. They are guidelines, certain expectations on behalf of the synod. Maybe there are ways to negotiate that or handle that in different ways. One of the possibilities, I do think there's a little bit of a difference between the different supply opportunities. I'm working off memory and not reading, but a seminary student might be a little bit lower cost, for example, than a ordained person. SAMs might have a different cost structure as well. So there are some different levels of possibility there. I'll welcome others to kind of chime in, and maybe Tim, if you might even share a little bit, if you have any sense of how this might have been handled already, even before now.
Right. We've had that has been ongoing. We had that 10 years ago when I started, and it existed 40 years ago, that there are congregations who get to the point when they can't afford a supply. We certainly are willing to have a conversation with people about that, and we do with some frequency, including with congregations who have 15 people in worship and a full-time office person. And we're like, if you're a 15 people in worship congregation, probably having a full-time office person is maybe not the best priority if we're a word and sacrament church, and so, I mean, that's a real case that we dealt with very recently. and this is going to sound harsh, I will say it, however, if a congregation is not able to afford a supply, then probably we would want to visit with their leadership and with the whole congregation, even to talk about at least, if not yoking with somebody else, sharing ministry in a different way, or possible holy closure. Because a supply is just about getting to the very minimum way for a word and sacrament ministry to happen. That said, I think as Pastor Andrew mentioned, there are cheaper options as far as total costs. Lay preachers, for instance, don't cost as much as ordained ministers. And but there's not a way intentionally on the Synod office's part. We make the guidelines as the Synod, and so we are not in the habit of negotiating somebody to pay less than the guidelines. I'm not sure how we would manage that. So, Pastor Cece, I'm kind of looking at you because I'm sort of bumbling around here, but if we have a saying at the Synod office, if we expect it, we model it. So yeah, if a congregation cannot afford a supply, which would be somewhere with all the Sundays of the year, if it's just one service, presumably it is just one service, then that means that congregation can't come up with $14,000 or $15,000 maximum, per year. And that's with the new guidelines. It would be probably 14 or 15,000 if you're just using supplies. The only thing that I could say where people I know have saved some money is there are some congregations, and we are aware of them, that they have a supply twice a month that the Synod assigns, and they have communion those days, and people in the congregation preach and lead worship without compensation on the other 2 Sundays. We do have a few of those. Pastor Cece, what do you want to add?
Yes, I was going to say it become more a part of what we do. So one of the things that we instituted is getting a financial picture from the congregation before we even start talking about doing the study or doing the ministry site profile to get them started to looking, that we want them to assess what they have in their congregation. And Michael Denise was really good at helping them to look at their finances to see the places where they had opportunity to cut back on some things and to move in different places. But I think the biggest thing is to understand that if a congregation just says, we have this much to offer, and then letting that person decide if they feel called to come, and if that's enough for them to be able to live comfortably, and then determining what percentage of the compensation guidelines does that cover. And so calling them, then they can begin to discuss, well, if I'm 3/4 time and I want benefits and those type of things, and you have $120,000 to work with, then that means I can do this. And so there are ways to negotiate that, which was one of the most beautiful things that Pastor Andrew added, is to allow congregations and rostered ministers to figure out, what does this look like for us? What responsibilities that historically have been done by the pastoral leader will now need to be done by lay people? For instance, one of our congregations, Ebenezer, created a core ministry team to help with pastoral visits during their time where they have a pastoral vacancy, so that everybody gets visited in a hospital. We have a deacon who is wanting to help congregations do Stephen's ministry, because we recognize that this is indeed the path that we need to take, but there are congregations that just can't afford it. And so helping rostered leaders understand is important, but also helping congregations understand what it looks like to go into that type of negotiation and figure out what are the things that we can offer,
sometimes there are benefits that come with the job. We talk about the number of pastors that are now willing to stay in a parsonage because the cost of housing has gone up so high. But that also means that counts as income. So we have to measure, all of those things. And so I just say, if you are thinking about doing it, know that the Senate office is not willing to come in and do the negotiation, but will help you to understand the ways that you have room to negotiate and how to figure that part out. And I have found that we have done a lot of pivoting. The bishop already mentioned the SAMS program and the Advanced Lay Ministers program, that there are ways to augment it that's doable. We even have a few congregations that are either helping to share across city lines or even across state lines in a shared ministry or yoking relationship. And so just coming in, having a realistic view and just being open to how the Spirit moves us is really important. What we don't want to happen is for the rostered minister or the congregation to feel like that's just out of range. If we can talk about what that might look like differently, we talk about having a pastor that works a different job, whether it's counseling, chaplaincy, or some other vocation that they're bivocational. We can have those conversations when a congregation is ready to go in the call process or thinking about next year's budget for their current call pastor.
Pastor Andrew, we've also got some questions in the chat. One of the questions is the 2-year increase loaded more in the first year than the second? Can you elaborate on that?
I can. I welcome others to chime in from the committee too. There is a little bit more in the first year than on the second year. If you want to take a look at the charts, I want to say, let's just so we're looking on the same page. That would be page 7 and 8 by my count. I hope I didn't get that wrong again on the guidelines, but if you want to take a look at those. So yes, it is a little front loaded in 2026 and then a little bit less of an increase in 2027. My sense on the rationale for that, and this was a conversation that happened across the committee and I imagine happened in the Senate Council as well. So the guidelines for the last really 4 or 5 years have been pretty far behind. So for 22, 3, 4, 5, all through those years, we've been well behind inflation and getting further behind in each year. And so in order to catch back up, one way to do it would have been to go halfway there in 2026, go the other half in 2027. I think what we did instead was we opted for a tad more in 2026, just so being that far behind was less of a continuational struggle. And then we had that smaller increase there for 2027. It's not 50%. I want to say it's more like maybe a 2/3 in 2026, and then the remaining third, roughly, that's not exact, in 2027. But as it stands right now, compared to where guidelines would be had we always adjusted for inflation, current ministry leaders are pretty far behind as compared to 2021. This will help catch them up a little bit quicker, but still also is kind of a deference to help congregations not have to have we could have done it all in 1 year, for example, but this gives kind of that gradual way to handle that increase across 2 years.
And a related question, do you know the difference between the percentage increase that went from 25 to 26? That's one of the.
So just using the Ministry of Word and Sacrament year 1, for this year, it's 60,000 for 2025. For 2026, we're recommending 68,000. So it's an increase of 8,000, right? So that's 12% roughly. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then for 2027, we're recommending 72,853. But just for reference, back in 2021, that year 1 Minister of Word and Sacrament number was 59,300. So it only changed by $700 between 2021 and 2025. And we know that inflation, we all lived the inflation from in those years. And so we need to catch up, and that's why it is front weighted on that on 2026.
Karen, thank you for that. And kind of to even add to your point, a lot of the most significant inflation really was during the last of the COVID years. 2023, I think, has been kind of the benchmark for the highest level. By just off the top of my head, since I think we hit almost 9% in that one year, at least for part of that year. And then it's been varying percentages from then, but across that cumulative time, and inflation builds upon itself. So 9% one year, if it's 5% the next year, we're still adding on top of what was before. It's always going to go that way. That's where we have that 20% roughly difference. I want to say it's 19.98%, rough, something in that ballpark across those years. So that was a desire to kind of help rostered leaders or ministers to begin to kind of make a little bit more progress back towards something that is a little more inflation adjusted. But again, to make it gradual for the benefit of congregations, so nobody follows or has too big a challenge right up front. I do see another question. Can I kind of jump in on the next one, Tammy? Roy shared what was the increase from the 2024 guideline. Roy, just to kind of follow up, so would that be from 2024 to 2025 or 2024 into 2026? I don't know if you have the ability to clarify.
From 24 to 26.
Yeah. So inflation has been down, fortunately. I don't know, I don't remember what the number was for 2024. We're currently just under 3% for 2025 right now, kind of as things are flowing, is my understanding. 2024 was kind of in that 3 point something to 4% level. So it definitely has been less. The guidelines, however, only changed by that $700 from 2021 in one particular year and then stayed that level throughout. And then the years of experience are just a percentage multiplier of that first year's salary. So there's always the level of experience, but then there's the inflation reality was really never factored in, with the exception of something like about 1% across 5 years cumulatively. I don't know, Roy, if that answers your question, but I hope that at least begins to help the conversation.
Well, as I said in the chat, I've not seen the document yet, but I'm trying to get a feel from if we were working with the guidelines, per the guidelines for the current year, 25, what, roughly speaking, is the percentage increase to 26 and then to 27 from that base level?
Yeah, so it would be, I'm doing the math off the top of my head, about 12% in 2026 from 2025.
Okay.
And then probably about maybe 7-8%, something like that for 2027. Somebody could do the math on that better than I could. I'm going to give you just a quick best guess.
So roughly 20% over the 2 years.
20% plus, actually 3% was kind of built in for each year as well.
Right.
So we're anticipating inflation for 2026 in the 3% range, and in 2027 in the 3% range. So that's all built into that total amount that adjusts into 2027, where you see that number.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And there's another one, do we have a sense of what portion of our full-time word and sacrament, word and service roster ministers are under call are compensated at current Synod guidelines?
I'd have to defer to Bishop Tim and his staff for that, please.
The answer is we don't know, which sounds like a lame answer, but fewer than half of our rostered ministers in their annual report to the bishop actually list their compensation that they're asked to list for whatever reason. And so we really don't have a statistical basis to be able to tell you with any confidence. I just, from conversations with people, I think it's fewer than half of our rostered ministers make the actual guidelines.
And Tim, could I chime in with that? So we did talk about this a little bit, and we've worked with kind of that guess as well. The hope with the guidelines that we're working on for 26 and 27 and have proposed is that these guidelines will become very relevant. The prior guidelines often became what I'll call a first year guideline. When somebody started a call, the congregations and the minister would consider guidelines, and then rarely were they consulted after that. Maybe in certain aspects they were. In many congregations, it was more arbitrary how things were handled from that point on. The goal of the guidelines moving forward is to make this such a relevant guideline that all congregations would find them very helpful, would utilize them, and do so every year when budgeting for compensation for ministry leaders. This way, it will take away a little bit of that uncertainty about what is fair compensation or what is proper compensation. There is also, as mentioned before, probably an opportunity of discernment. It might be that looking at the guidelines now and into the years to come, there might be a reassessment of, are we still a full-time call, for example, or at our current compensation level, are we changing into maybe more of a part-time reality so that we can be fair to what is full-time compensation? And the guidelines do provide a mechanism for creating kind of that sense of what percentage of full time are we at right now. And that's really kind of a fair way for ministers and congregations to assess where they are in each year. To be honest, there's perhaps going to be some humbling thought with that, particularly in the first go round or two. But ideally, this will offer an opportunity for congregations and ministers to work together and to make sure that compensation is fair for not only their setting, but as compared to settings all across the Synod. One of the hopes I think that we as a committee had was that as the guidelines would be utilized, this would streamline compensation and help ministers and congregations work together longer so that ministers did not feel a need to have to change calls in order to gain or get back to some level of compensation that was more like guidelines. But allow congregations to work together, and ministers and congregations have those longer calls together, those longer experiences together that are so beneficial. We'll see how that plays out, but I certainly hope that would be the case. And then on top of that, it creates kind of a level playing field for everyone, and it helps churches assess, where are their gifts and talents and needs in ministry on a regular basis. And are there opportunities, as was mentioned, I think, by Cece, where congregational leadership can step in if needed in order to bridge some of the change if there is a desire to move towards something other than a full-time setting?
I was just looking up something that I hadn't looked at before, but I think that in the guidelines it mentions that years ago, when guidelines became a thing, what was used in a number of synods, including North Carolina, was school principals as a comparable education responsibility level for clergy people. And so when our guidelines began 40 some years ago, that was the sort of comparable piece where we started for word and sacrament ministers. I just looked it up, and the minimum principal's salary in 2023 was $75,500 in North Carolina. And for the last 20 years, we have had a very frugal legislature that has not gone up a lot on education and salaries for teachers and school administrators. But in the time since we initiated the guidelines, you have school principals now who are in the 80,000 beginning salary range, and then you have pastors who are in the 60,000 range. So, I mean, there's really quite a gap there. So, you may make the argument that that's not a good analogy, but that's where we came from, and the gap has grown. But that's we've gone up 1.5%, Pastor Andrew, for more than 15 years. Over time, you're going to get way behind. Because inflation averages over the long haul closer to the 3% range to 4% range. So I'm not making an argument one way or the other. I'm just telling you we're very far apart from where we started.
Tammy, if I could jump into the next question. So Larry, thank you for your question. He wrote, my concern is if we go up another 20%, then Portico goes up another 5% or more. Pretty much just to give some background, Portico, as far as benefits for health, and then they also do retirement as well. Those are basically percentages of defined compensation. There's some calculators that Portico offers, and annually those determine what the cost of those benefits will be. And there's some factors there that are pretty significant, such as how many are insured. Is it just a minister? Is it a spouse? Is it dependents, children, for example? So those all factor into how that's determined. I don't have a lot of information about this beyond what anyone might have received, but Portico is getting ready to restructure some things pretty significantly as far as what's offered for healthcare primarily. I think retirement is going to remain at a recommended 12%, but those will be different options that will be available to congregations for consideration as well. The guidelines gives provisions for what the guidelines are for healthcare options, but then there's some discernment that is part of dealing with Portico as well. Healthcare is one of those things. If this seems like a significant change when it comes to inflation, healthcare beats inflation by a mile. And so the healthcare costs that Portico is working with, they're trying to manage those, and they've made some pretty big adjustments that have affected some folks or will affect some folks on Portico healthcare in the time to come. But all that said, yes, your concern is there, Larry. Those do affect Portico determinations for retirement and other things as well. One of the things on I guess there's kind of two angles to this. I think the temptation is always to look at this from a congregation's level, because this is a cost and that is a budgeted thing. From a minister's level, there's also a way to look at this. And, we had mentioned about spending power or a reduction in spending power due to inflation, for example. Many ministers do not envy having to kind of figure out what is the best option for a family that might involve having to discern a change in call that they don't want to make, or to look at other options that may not be that savory if compensation is held too low. I don't have statistics on this, but there are many ministers who are dealing with some financial challenges, some of it relating still to paying for seminary with student loans, some of the other things that were mentioned, and just life expenses, sending kids to school, that kind of thing, just housing in general, which has gotten very expensive. So ministers are looking at the guidelines also, and there's some discernment here that no minister wants to be unfairly highly paid. They want to be fairly compensated. And that's the goal in the guidelines, is to figure out and determine what is fair compensation. I think when Bishop Tim mentioned about a principal salary, that used to be the standard. I was aware of that too. But that really, we've fallen well behind that. Even with the changes in guidelines as proposed, if they are approved, we're still going to be behind that. But this is getting us a little bit closer. It's gradually getting us there.
Other questions? For me, I just want to say, I'll say it again. Thanks for your team's work. It's a lot, and for all the considerations.
I do have a question. I just started typing it in the chat. Page 9, the first paragraph talks about a full-time ministry call, etc. It says congregations, churches, and willing ministers who mutually choose to be compensated below these full-time minimum guidelines shall be considered part-time calls for compensation and service. That cuts into all your other benefits?
That would not necessarily affect benefits. Portico's minimum for benefits, I think, is 15 hours. We have to double check on that, but I believe that's in the ballpark. So essentially, Portico, again, is a percentage of salary, is how they determine healthcare costs, for example, and then retirement is a percentage of, not salary, defined compensation. And so a part-time situation would probably incur a lower cost for benefits as well. But unless it were so part-time that Portico could not be considered and other options would need to be considered in their place, then I think it would remain that that would still be commensurate to whatever the compensation was at a part-time determined amount.
I was just wondering how, since so many of our pastors are taking less than standard, and this definition says they're then considered part-time, what are the ramifications of calling them part-time now?
Yeah.
When we say, may I,
Go ahead.
Andrew, if I could,
Please.
that is how the synod would deem and approach that congregation's call. If the rostered minister says, I'll work full-time for that amount, that contract, we are not the employer in the North Carolina Synod. We're the synod office and the synod assembly. So you can make your contract and agreement for whatever you decide to do. And I know it doesn't help always to work from the extremes, but when I started, we had a pastor who had about 32 years of experience, whose total everything compensation was $39,000, and they were working full time. And so our perspective, and especially if you were going into the call process, I won't give you too much information so that you might be able to guess, but we do have some recent congregations who have gone into the call process where their rostered minister served for decades and then never took a salary increase ever. And then they were just completely shocked that if they were going to be in the call process at Guidelines, it was going to be twice as much for an entry-level person as they were paying somebody after a lifetime of ministry. And that seems problematic. That statement is mainly to say there's no shame in being able to pay what you're able to pay, but we don't want rostered ministers to be expected to work. That's why we have 2 votes in a call process. We say we're going to discern what the Holy Spirit's asking us to do, first of all, mutually, and then we're going to vote on what that compensation is. There's a point where it's a struggle for congregations, absolutely no doubt. And every congregation has a number. It's just, it's different depending on where they are and how many people they have and what their budget is and all of that. There also are situations that I would almost call abusive, where congregations have been happy to let the Holy Spirit say, you're called here, and so therefore you need to take what we give you. And one of my favorite lines when I visit with congregations in the call process is they're like, well, we remember when we used to have clergy who did this because they loved Jesus, not because they wanted the money. And I love that, because we're Lutherans and we're the ones who invented the priesthood of believers. And so, if you work on a construction crew, I usually ask the person asking that, what did you do? Oh, I worked on a construction crew. Well, how come you didn't do that because you love Jesus rather than for the money? It's no different for a clergy person than it is for any of the baptized. And so I don't mean at all to be flippant or defensive about it, but through the years, we have an awful lot of people, especially historically, who've worked for next to nothing. And then we have people who can't ever retire because they never made any money. And so they're out there trying to supply at 88 years old, and they can't really do it. And if you follow the trail of where they served and what their compensation was, it doesn't seem right that the church even allowed them to do that, much less supported them in doing that. That's why we would say, if there's no shame in it, what can you do? How can we go? Whatever it is that we have, let's just deal with what the reality is. And one way to do that is to call it less than full time based on the guidelines.
I know that, there's a need that becomes an expectation to receive full-time service for part-time pay.
I'd say that's a pretty common attempt. A number of our congregations think in a very business model sort of a way, and they want to. I mean, I've even sat in on council meetings where they say, well, let's lowball them to begin with and see if they take it, and I'm like, oh, wish I hadn't heard you say that, because if we can get them for next to nothing, let's do that. That doesn't seem particularly responsible, and we like to hold in tension the whole and healthy leaders now and vital congregations, and I know that the great majority of our congregations are doing the best that they can, and that's why we're doing lay preachers, SAMs, yoking, all these other ways. Let's think of other ways we can make this work if we have fewer dollars to put toward this. But trying to get somebody to work full time for a half-time salary is probably not the faithful answer.
I'm not seeing any more questions unless I've missed one, any. Going once, going twice. I also, if you have specific assembly questions, I'm happy to stay on here for a few minutes for anything about assembly and all that jazz. So, but otherwise, anything else for Pastor
You have about 4 hours to register, right?
That's right. That's right. If your folks haven't registered, we also need the new names if names have changed and all that. So, but if you have any questions, I'll do what I can.
Hey, Tammy.
Yes.
It's Tony. Just a reminder, we're doing this next week as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, the budget is on Tuesday.
Peggy Schaffner's got her hand up.
Yes, Peggy.
We were on the call with LDR Monday night, and there's still confusion about this pre-assembly, that people don't understand that they're supposed to pay that extra $30 if they're going to register.
It is in the registration. So if you choose pre-assembly on the registration, it automatically adds the $30 to your total at the end. So for example, if you registered when the price of assembly was $300, as soon as you said, yes, I plan to come to pre-assembly, it would add $30. So your total would be $330.
Okay. All right. Well, we did that. I mean, he didn't register us both at the same initially, but he went back in and did it. So, but there still seemed to be confusion about that.
So when you say he went back in and did it, do you mean that he registered like on this is the pre-assembly only form?
Yes.
Okay. That's fine.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's all. Thanks. Very helpful.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Any other assembly questions? All right. Friends, we'll see you later.
Thank you.